Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Maya Gaynor, and I'm the editor-in-chief of SAIS Perspectives. Perspectives is the International Development Program's student-run publication, and our goal is to provide SAIS students, faculty members, and members of the broader community with a platform to share their ideas about the most pressing issues in international development. We publish articles and blog posts drawn from work that students do in their classes at SAIS or from people's experiences in the field. We also value photojournalism as a storytelling tool, which is why we hold a photo contest every year. We see the photo contest as an equally important way for members of the SAIS community to share their experiences and communicate what matters to them in development. This year, we've been able to share our winners' work with all of you in a much larger forum and situate it in a broader discussion of the intersection between photography and policy. And we're very grateful to everyone who's made this event possible. I'd especially like to thank the Big Picture Initiative of the Foreign Policy Institute, the Office of Dean Nasser, Joe Newman at Focus on the Story, a nonprofit that supports social change through creative storytelling, and the International Development Program for all of their hard work and support. For me, photography gives us an opportunity to think about big issues in a more intimate way. As our panelists will discuss in more detail, seeing the face of another human being and connecting the emotions that a photograph can evoke with a policy debate lays a foundation for making good decisions that take the human stakes into account. That's why I value the SAIS Perspectives photo contest and the work you'll see on display this evening from our winners, from James Whitlow Delano, and from the winners of the Focus on the Story Awards. Their work reminds us that being a policymaker doesn't just require expertise, it also demands empathy. Empathy is especially important in approaching the theme that SAIS Perspectives has selected for this year, work in a changing world. Waking up and going to work is an experience shared by billions of people all over the world, but as the world changes, that everyday act is meeting more and more challenges. Technology and globalization are changing the types of jobs available and the skills needed to fill them. In developing countries, the growing numbers of youth and women joining the workforce are changing who we understand as a worker, but policy hasn't always kept up. Climate change is fundamentally reshaping agricultural livelihoods. Hundreds of millions of people are trying to make a living despite being surrounded by conflict and violence. This year's issue of SAIS Perspectives will explore how people are responding to these forces and what policies can help them do so, but always with an appreciation for the human impact of these debates. We're now accepting submissions for this issue, so if you have ideas to share on this subject, I encourage you to visit our website, saisperspectives.com, for more information on how we can publish your work, because I'm sure there are many people in this room who have great stories to tell. This issue touches everyone, everywhere. Even in the most challenging of circumstances, people find a way to keep working to provide for themselves and for their loved ones. Respect for that is the starting point for this issue of SAIS Perspectives, and I think that's captured perfectly in the first place photo from this year's contest. I could say a lot more about this image, but I'd rather let the photographer do it. So to tell the story of his winning photo and what it means to him, I'd like to welcome Masters of International Public Policy student, Rory OConnor.
Hope I don't mess this one up. Click next. All right. All right, so my name is Rory OConnor, and last year I watched a documentary about a World War II photographer named Tony Vaccaro. Going to war, he was already a photographer. He could have landed a really cush job in the rear, but instead he enlisted as an infantryman with his own camera because the ones that war photographers carried at the time were too big and bulky compared to his own. What he was able to capture with this simple camera was the side of war that people don't always get to see. The front line, the good, the bad, life and death. He was granted that access because he was a part of it. Mr. Vaccaro had a way of capturing the intricacies of an experience and conveying something so complex that it touched on all the senses that it evoked in him. This past year, with Tony Vaccaro's story in the back of my mind, I deployed for a second time to Afghanistan. We've been at war in Afghanistan for well over 17 years. Now, I don't want to talk about why we were at war, whether it's something that you support or not. What I'd like to emphasize is that life has continued in Afghanistan. Like every contentious place in the world, life never stops. From what I have experienced, especially there, that's very true. In the northern city of Kunduz, there's a bustling downtown with entertainment stores and ice cream parlors, local radio personalities, and Bollywood celebrities. The countryside is known as the breadbasket of Afghanistan, where melons, fruits, rice, and wheat are grown and then distributed throughout the region. There's a palpable sense of history in this area. It's a difficult scene for me to convey because when I rode around, it was in that hulking vehicle you see there. Unless something went terribly wrong, there was usually several tons of steel separating me from those goats. Thank God. Even though the danger of the situation made it necessary, being separated from the daily life of Afghanistan made it difficult for me to do my job. I can't count the number of times I wished that I could have just walked around the city like we do here. Being a guest in another country, welcomed by some and unwelcomed by others, is complicated and emotional. The fears you have are in the uncertainties, in the unexpected. So you try to expect everything. But if you give in to that, it isn't too long before you fear everything. At some point, I realized that the same uncertainties that scared me scared the people of these small villages. And what's more is that they've been living that way for well over 50 years. It made it very difficult to convince anyone I was there to help if I reminded them of the very fear and uncertainty that they lived with. The hard truth for some is that not everyone in a war zone is at war. Some of them just want you to acknowledge them when you pass, to pay the proper respects, to keep farming and producing so that they can provide for their families. Some of them are just going to work. For my unit and for my team, we tried our very best to do our fighting and our battles outside of where people lived. It can be trumped up to psychological operations or civil considerations, but there was a very human element to it. How am I supposed to be at war when there are people all around me trying to live their lives like I'm not even there? But sometimes war is just where it is. I took this picture in a small village outside of Kunduz city. It was the third and last day of a clearance operation where I'd spent most of my time budgeting between coordinating the clearance operation and holding churros with local leaders and villagers alike. As the sun came up, we'd already been at work for a few hours when a slow cloud emerged out of thin air from a village road to our south. There was clanking of dull bells and these guttural yells from the shepherds. We didn't really know what was going on at the time, honestly. There was a moment of unease as nearly 100 goats and their herders surrounded my vehicle. All that fear welled up, but it subsided as the man in this picture saw me. I didn't have a gun in my hand, I just had my camera. He smiled slightly, uneasily at first, but he put his right hand over his chest and slightly bowed, and I did the same. He was just going to work, and so was I. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. One thing I love about this image and the story that you've told is how it gives us a window into something far bigger and makes it possible to wrap our minds around the complexity. And that's something also that I think makes our next speaker's work so powerful, because he takes a keen eye for the relatable moments into some of the world's biggest stories. James Whitlow Delano is an award-winning documentary photographer based in Tokyo who's come to share some of his work with us. He's published 4 monograph photo books and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Alfred Eisenstadt Award, the Oscar Barnack Award, the National Press Photographers Association Best of Photojournalism, and Picture of the Year International. He's also a grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. His projects have covered everything from climate change and deforestation to migration and human rights. And his latest work, which he'll be presenting today, focuses on the impact of President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war on poor families in the Philippines. Following James's presentation, he'll be joined on stage for a panel discussion by Professor Tanvi Nagpal, the director of the International Development Program here at SAIS. She spent a decade at the World Bank, where she focused on urban policy and programs, and has also worked extensively on water and sanitation for nonprofits and foundations. I know from taking her Inclusive and Sustainable Urbanization class last year that she brings both knowledge and passion to discussions of urban poverty, and she'll provide some of the policy context around James's work. Moderating the discussion will be Shamaila Chaudhry, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute and a senior advisor to Dean Nasser. She leads the Big Picture Initiative, which explores foreign policy through the lens of arts and culture. So we'll first hear from James and see some of his most recent work, and then the rest of the panel will discuss it and answer some of your questions. Please join me in welcoming documentary photographer James Whitlow Delano.
Well, first of all, thank you all for very much. Shamaila, thank you for inviting me. Joe Newman is around here somewhere, and thank you as well for the opportunity that is presented to me. This is exactly, in fact, your speech was so impressive because I think you eloquently stated what the best photojournalism attempts to accomplish, and that is to place us in the position to create a context so that we can understand both sides of an issue. I personally am most interested in the lives of everyday people. And lives of everyday people in the news, as all of us know, oftentimes get swept under the rug. And to me, that they're the people who are written out of history. And so this is an attempt. I have a long-term relationship with the Philippines, and I'll get into that in a second. And I hope that I can provide a perspective for the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, why he is there, what he's done, what I see as almost an epic betrayal of those who supported him to get him into office. So just to give a little background before we get into, this is a photograph of a funeral, but with my experience in the Philippines, my ex-wife was Filipino-American. Her parents were born in the Philippines. I don't look Filipino, I'm not, but for 10 years I was a de facto member of a Filipino family. It was the first country in Asia I visited. So it's a country that is very close to my heart, and perhaps I understand a little bit more of it about the culture than someone who would just kind of enter into the country without any background in the culture, the food, the language, and so on. Why is Duterte important? And that kind of ties into the post-colonial politics. And if you think about People Power 1 and People Power 2, People Power 1 was Corazon Aquino Cojuangco. The Cojuangco family is one of the most powerful families in the Philippines. They own sugar plantations, they own San Miguel beer, many corporations. This doesn't look very much like People Power to me. Then you had Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, People Power 2. She's the daughter of Diodoro Macapagal, former president of the Philippines. That doesn't look very much like People Power bubbling up. So with this as kind of the baseline, the background, here comes Rodrigo Duterte, who really is not a part of the power structure. Upper middle class, I believe he's a child of attorneys. And I was in the slums documenting climate change and poverty before. I've been documenting slums for many years, but I just happened to be there after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated. And I did a story on, here are the challenges this man's going to face. And in the slums, people were wearing Duterte t-shirts, Duterte armbands. They thought, finally, here's this man who's going to be our savior. He's going to pull us up. He's going to give us the opportunities that have not been afforded us. He's going to be the disruptor and change things in the Philippines for the better. And what I'm about to show you is how that got turned on its head, because it's not the upper class or the middle classes that are dying, it's the people in the slums. Just hit this forward. Okay. So I went there actually to document the 1 year into the drug war. And what I found was that the spasm of violence had not let up at all. These are young men who, this is dawn on the edge of Metro Manila. And a lot of the killings, most of the killings, of course, were directly related to drugs, but these young men were, I guess, bag snatchers. They had signs on their neck saying, no bag grabbers, they said in Tagalog. It's kind of a mix of English. So there's a lot of score settling going on as well. And every night, we would go out and we would encounter someone would give a tweet, or we would have a contact and they'd say, go to this place. This is, and I'll get more into this later, this is Jacelyn Soriano, and her brother was executed. I'll get into why it's so obvious later. It's not all, the tragedy doesn't go away, but I will say right now that I met with her last July and she had a smile on her face, which was quite heartening, because I was meeting people on the worst imaginable days of their lives, inexplicable sorrow. And I'll get into the details of why he was killed and what happened a little bit later. My examination of this subject has and will always be the collateral damage, the families that are left to pick up the pieces, and it's usually women. So this is Remi Fernandez. She's 85 now. Her son was killed in that chair. She couldn't afford to buy a new one. In fact, for weeks she didn't even clean the blood out. She's left to raise 7 children. At this time, her daughter-in-law was in prison on drug charges. So she wasn't killed like her son. And what happened was her son was told not to come back. And he decided on the birthday of CJ to cook a pasta dinner, and they killed him. You know, word got around that he had been there. There's the bullet hole in the chair. I mean, these people, they don't know me, and they're letting me in their lives because they want their story told. It's a very open and friendly and kind society, and it's my responsibility to be here today to tell you about this. I feel that there is a role to be played here, and it isn't just subjective journalism here. This is speaking the truth, showing people's conditions and the effects of this drug war on people, the ripples that it's sending out. This is Jasmine Durana. She was 14 at the time. Her husband was murdered right here. She's dragged out by the hair, and she had a gun pointed at her and said, if you resist, we'll kill you too. I would later learn, which was quite interesting, is that Toto, her husband, was not the biological father of Hazel, the child. Hazel's father abandoned the family. And I'll show you a little bit later. I'm still in contact with Jasmine. I went back and kind of documented her trying to put her life back together. Now, I don't know for sure, but Jasmine is incredibly small. She's tried to go back to school. She was hit by a jeepney when she was in the 2nd grade. She was out of school for 2 years. She tried to go back to school, and she just can't learn. She can't remember. And if you have malnutrition in your first 4 or 5 years, you can have a learning deficit. So she seems to be struggling with that. She's from a good family, and she's doing better, but this is also one of these undercurrents of life in the slums. This is in Navotas, Metro Manila. This is just the kind of scenes you come upon. I just found it interesting that Madonna was there to protect. This was the scene where a father tried to defend his adopted son, so they just killed them both in their bedroom. This is Jacelyn right there on the night that her brother was assassinated. So I'm trying to convey, this isn't voyeurism. This is people's raw sorrow, and unnecessary, completely unnecessary. And I'm hoping what will happen is that enough people will learn about this so that we can stop it. It's on the decrease, and I think that this kind of coverage is why the level of assassination has gone down. This is Julius Soriano, who's 24. He's the young man who's being carried away here. So what's the evidence of the assassination? His hands were bound by, those plastic zip cords. Okay, the police said that he pulled a gun on them. He's been shot. Here's the bullet, and it was stopped by whatever was holding his arms. So he was clearly assassinated. Then they cut the zip ties and then made up the story. And this is happening all over. They decide who they want to kill. And I met Jenilyn a year later, and she said that he did sometimes he was trying to meet a drug dealer in a cemetery. The police went for the drug dealer. The drug dealer was not there, so they killed him. They had to come back with someone. And this is the kind of scene you encounter. This is Navotas. It's part of Metro Manila. What I find fascinating about this, I've been living in Asia for 25 years. Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, most of the Southeast Asian nations have seen their slums, if not drained completely, greatly diminished in the number of people living like this. Not so in the Philippines. If anything, the slums have gotten bigger. Philippines has a middle class. Its economy is doing well. So it does have a burgeoning middle class, but for some reason, people in this condition, this level of income, are not seeing opportunity. There's a wonderful sense of humor in the Philippines, but also, this is not necessarily graveyard humor, but it's just a reminder. This is Market 3 slum. They've lost a lot of people to the, they call it tokang, knock and plead. It's actually a Visayan word, and that's what happens. The police knock and you plead for your life, tokang. Again, this is where Jasmine lived. That's Jasmine right there. 7 people live in that house. Evidence of assassination. I saw time and time again, bullet over the heart, bullet in the back of the head. And this particular night, bullets in the forearms, because they would try to block the bullets in vain, and then they would be executed. These are the targets. This is at a crime scene, just to get an idea of the terror in the community and the age group that are really drinking this all in. And what will be the effect on their generation? What is this doing to their minds? This is Manuel Borbe. He was killed. Another of his friend, they were drinking together. You can see the blood there. Apparently his friend made it to the hospital. Unfortunately, I couldn't follow up, but it didn't look like he survived. So they were drinking there. There was one motorcycle up here, lookout, and the road went this way. And so this lookout made sure the coast was clear, and they drove by and did a drive-by shooting. Fast. Support for Duterte in the slums. Not sure why, but he does have support still. These are the 3 men who were killed. All of them had wounds in their forearms. This is kind of the graveyard humor. The Philippines has suffered a lot over the centuries, and they've developed a wonderful sense of humor to get, to cope with it. This was near a bridge where they were throwing bodies in the river, and the tides would take them out into the bay. Again, uniquely Filipino, because it's a warm and friendly society. This is Junmar Ablete's funeral. So we're on the way to the cemetery, and we happen to pass the jail, Navotas jail, where his 2 brothers are incarcerated on drug charges. They were lucky enough to be arrested before the drug war started. They brought them out of the jail to say goodbye to their brother. You can see that they're handcuffed. I cannot imagine another country where that would be possible. So it's incredibly open society. Here they are putting the casket in the tomb. If you've ever seen Latin American tombs of, stacked on top of one another, Brazil, Guatemala, Philippines, a Spanish colony, has that tradition. This is Junmar's son and his mother. So she's going to have to raise him. What's particularly tragic about this is Junmar was down in the island of Samar, safe, and they told him not to come back. This is kind of a, a theme. And he didn't for a while. Then he came back to collect his parents for a visit to Samar, and they got him. They killed him while he was back visiting. That's his mother. Incredibly compassionate. She was working in Singapore, and the landscape of poverty. So she was in Singapore. Her daughter's 16, is killed with her boyfriend. She's pregnant. So you lost 2 lives. She had to get down on her knees to ask her boss to come back for the funeral. This is Jocelyn Bunting. She's now 15. This is taken on Smoky Mountain, the former dump site that used to always be smoking with combustion. Now it's become this kind of perverse green island in Tondo slum. She has since been, she married a man who was 40. She had given birth to a client's child who didn't own up to his paternity. Boy Muslim, it was his nickname, went out for a beer one night and never came back. Since this photo was taken, Jocelyn was arrested. She took methamphetamine, it's called shabu, and she said at 15 that she was 19. She thought, I'll get in less trouble if I'm an adult. They sent her to an adult prison. She is now out. I'll have a little bit more about her later, but she may be going back into this as a sex worker. She was working in the Port District, and she cut herself as well. So the point being is that she wants opportunity. She just doesn't have it. But this is all she knows. So if or when I get back again, I'm in touch with Lenny, who is wonderful, her mother. And on my second trip, we were trying to get her out of prison. Well, no, I wasn't. Lenny was. And I documented that. Lenny's, for example, Princess, this is Jocelyn's daughter, but she thinks Lenny's her mother because Lenny's raising her. And at this time, Jocelyn was living in Market 3 at the bar, and Lenny was living, and still does, on Smoky Mountain, so the baby stayed with grandma. So this is happening all over. This is a woman named Rhoda. She's actually doing quite well, selling Avon now, but, okay, she's raising 7 children. 4 are her husbands from a previous marriage, 2 are hers from a previous marriage, and the baby is hers with her husband's. And he was killed. Now she's raising all of them in Payatas, a slum in Payatas, which is near a different city dump, which, by the way, they just closed. And if you're talking about options for work, and Remi Fernandez, the 85-year-old woman, as well lives there. So they were dependent on recycling. The dump closes, and now they're all going to have to move. So the menu of options it's just not attractive at all, to say the least. This is an area, it's kind of interesting. These men are sniffing glue. This is the route for the assassins to come into Market 3 slums because there was a armed guard at the front desk. So everybody's complicit. One of the things that was interesting with Jenilyn, for example, when we tried to relocate her, we had her address in a particular part of Manila. It took us 2 hours to find her house. So when the police are going to assassinate somebody, they enlist the services of the community leader they call Barangay Kapitan. There's no way you could find your target without somebody helping you through the labyrinth of slums. In the slums, there are stratifications of slums. There are cinder block slums, there are plywood and wood slums, and then there are the people who live in plastic tents. So this is Sara. She is now in prison. She may have some issues with mental illness as well. Her husband was killed and sat here for 25 days. One of the most chilling things that happened when I got back is a friend showed me a photo of Culot when he was alive. He was eventually buried in a mass grave because they couldn't afford to get one. So Sara's home was burnt down, and then she lived in this chicken coop. So you're talking about, so I guess the point when I go back is seeing who is working on helping to alleviate poverty and to give people opportunities. We're talking about people who are intelligent. They're just lacking opportunity. And why is Duterte picking on his base, in essence? This is Remy this past July. A year later, the baby's gotten bigger. Look at her hands. She's still responsible for the family, but her daughter-in-law who was in prison, has been released. But when I arrived, the daughter-in-law had left drunk the night before with 2 of her children, and we spent the next 3 days documenting Remy trying to find her. So the families are going through this. We went to the hospital, we went to the police, we went to relatives. And so Remy is not only, trying to keep the family together, she's trying to find her daughter-in-law. And we did, this is a river she goes up to buy produce. So I'm trying to give it an idea of just the strength of the people, just to keep it going, things we take for granted. Bringing down produce for, these are some of the guys who kind of party with her daughter-in-law, and this is Lourdes. After 3 days, she turned up, and if, you could cut the air with a knife. Just very, very, all the smiles went away. I don't blame her. She was afraid. Who's this guy? What does he want from us? And, she's back to her old habits. The worry is that she, too, at some point, may be assassinated or arrested. That would be a best-case scenario. This is Lenny. When I got there, we thought we could get, she was going to get her daughter, Jocelyn, out of prison. Imagine navigating the legal system. That day, it didn't happen. Here's a certificate of detention. So we went with her back and forth to the prison. So just to give you an idea of the challenges to get out of these ruts, here's Lenny when she realizes that Jocelyn's not going to get out that day. And Jocelyn's up here. Filipino prisons are fairly open, and you can go up and you can wave to your family member. And as I said, Jocelyn is now out. I haven't been able to get back yet. Quite curious. This is Jasmine now. She's preparing breakfast for Hazel, her life. Since I worked with Jasmine, she worked in a South Korean-owned massage parlor in Angeles City, which is known for sex workers. She said she wasn't doing sex work, but she was giving massages to foreign men. And she bought that watch with that money, but she quit because she didn't want to do it. It's not much opportunity. Internet cafe, so I'm still in touch. This is one of the alleyways. This is what I mean, like how can the police find, it's just a labyrinth. You have to know somebody. I don't know of any other country in the world where you post on Facebook your husband's photo in a casket, but they do in the Philippines. Jasmine's goal is to start a drinks business in the market. $40 a table, the jugs like this, an umbrella, and the makings for drinks. She was saving for 4 months, and all she could afford were these jugs. So it's no small task to get over that. Crime is back up. We saw these guys on the street. People were more afraid a year ago. This past summer, the crime has gone back up. These kids are like 8, 10 years old. Killing is continuing, but at a lesser pace. Sniffing glue, American Embassy. Huge problems, just not going away. I don't think drug use is really decreasing. I could go into that later, maybe in the panel discussion, but it's possible we're just seeing a changing of the guard. Duterte's son. Apparently, there is allegedly, possibly implicated in importing drugs from China. But we'll let journalists do their investigative journalism and figure this out. This just, to me, in a nutshell, is all that's wrong with the lack of opportunity in the Philippines. And another country, she would have opportunity, and she just doesn't. People are sleeping along the bay just to stay cool, but no one here has a home. Everybody here is homeless. Goes on for several hundred meters. And the thing is that they're from good families. The families stay together. There is substance abuse, but there is a community spirit in the Philippines that is absolutely amazing. Here are boys sniffing glue in payatas. I blurred their faces for obvious reasons. I don't want them to get in trouble. Street children in a place called Ermita, and you can see the katakana there. Sex work is prominent there, prevalent there. What's their future? That's my question. Very typical. So here you are in a nice place, and right across the street, people living on the street. It's a tough one, and Duterte has great support. So this is a story in progress. There is, and I hope to follow it so that I can, if any of you follow my work on Facebook or something, you can be updated. But I think I'm curious to see how the Philippines goes on to the next chapter. What will the post-Duterte Philippines look like? What ripples in those? That's why I call this fruits of impunity, collateral damage. The damage is already done. But what will the true ramifications be 10, 20, 30 years to Filipino society? The fear. And so this is just, I don't know any more than you do. More posing questions, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come out and view the series. Thank you.
Okay, wow, that was incredible. I think everyone will agree with me that it's a tremendous body of work. Very, very powerful. I want to thank everyone for coming. This is a mixed audience in that we have a combination of students, and we also have folks that we've reached out to through our focus on the story community. So I'm just really glad that we're able to kind of get outside of our policy bubble and bring others to help learn with us. So thanks again. One reason why I love this initiative is that it allows me to kind of understand the way our students see the world. And based on Rory's remarks and Maya's comments, they see the world in pretty tremendous ways. And the future is bright given that. And that's what I love about this contest. And we're glad to partner with it this year. So just a couple of reactions to James's presentation, and then I'm going to go right into questions with them. And then we'll open it up for Q&A with all of you. We'll try to wrap up by 6 o'clock. I know that there's a class that folks might have to leave for, so if you're leaving early around 5:45, no worries. Make sure you get to see the photographs in the back before you do of the student work. And then there's also an exhibit which includes more of images of James's work and some others from the Focus on the Story competition. So that's all out there. It seems to me that photography has had this democratizing influence on the voiceless. And seeing your work and you asking the question, well, why are these people letting me into their lives? Why are they trusting me? And it's because they have a story to tell. And it's a story that often gets ignored by policymakers and people who have power and the ability to change and influence their lives. So I've always kind of been attracted to documentary work for that reason. And it also just complements my understanding of foreign policy and how international issues play out. So I think there's a lot of value in that. I'd like to know from your perspective as a photographer who's covered many kind of critical issues that are policy relevant, how do you get your work to be in front of those that can actually influence and change in the policy space? You mentioned at some point that things are changing with regards to the drug war, and some conditions have improved. Could you talk a little bit more about that and your relationships that you develop, not just with your subjects, but also other organizations that might do work in this space?
Well, I have to be honest, what one person can do is limited. When I was mentioning that, I was kind of mentioning it in the collective, because let's not forget for a second that there are a lot of Filipino photographers who are doing this work day in and day out at a lot more risk. And the risk isn't only, I worry about them as friends, but also the authorities. So far, they haven't been targeted, but I'm also worried about PTSD. I know one photographer, day in and day out, for a year and a half, every night, he was documenting this. So the collective we. The same would go with, I documented tsunami in Japan. But also getting the work in front of NGOs' eyes and also published, of course. So I've been publishing this work, international publications, L'Espresso, The Guardian, because unless people see what's going on, then what's the benefit? Frankly, what I'm hoping to do is contribute as much as I can as one individual, but being realistic about calibrating expectations. And so I want this work to be a part of a larger body of work by a lot of different people who have different audiences. And I am very wary of taking any credit, because as I said, there are a lot of us out there doing great work. And again, I can go home, the Filipino photographers can't. In fact, I just took a hostile training course at Columbia before coming here, and a friend of mine is Filipino and American dual citizen. She's received death threats. I haven't, but she has. She lives she's moved to Bangkok in part because of that. So, yeah, there's a lot of risk.
That was going to be my next follow-up question, which is, have you faced any pressure on your work from the government side or the law enforcement side while you were doing it?
So far, the answer would be no, and I'm amazed at how open the Philippines has been. But I've noticed that it has been slowly closing. Some of the access that you see in this is no longer possible. Philippines is an amazingly open society. Very few places would you get access like this. So the benefit is that the world knows what's going on. So far, so good.
Yeah, no, I was surprised by some of the access, which it's tremendous for us as kind of practitioners of policy and those of us who will go on to work on policy, that we'll never be able to see such places that close up. So that's the benefit of documentary work for our field, no doubt. I was struck by the image of the slums, kind of the panoramic image, and how you mentioned that they're actually growing in the Philippines as compared to other Southeast Asian countries. And so I thought we could go to Tanvi to talk about the bigger picture with regards to the slum populations and those that live in poverty, and kind of connect that bigger picture to what's happening in the Philippines, and looking at how that experience of the poor is similar and different at the same time.
Yeah, so basically urbanization is apace, and about little more than half the world now lives in cities, and by 2050 it's like closer to 70%. But there's huge housing shortages in cities. So, about, 1.5 million people at any given time live in what they call informal settlements in the Philippines, of which 40% live in Manila. And so you can just imagine if that grows without those housing shortages being resolved, that population is just expected to keep growing both in Metro Manila and in those urban housing settlements. Again, what's urban is different in different parts of the world, but I think what's even more different is what we call a slum, and I think you referred to this. So, you could have a place called a slum which has concrete houses. You could have a place called a slum which has wooden shacks. You could have a place called a slum that is just plastic housing. But what's common among all of them is that all of them lack services, right? So None of them will have adequate water. None of them will have adequate sanitation. And just James' pictures, you can see their houses built on top of solid waste.
Yeah.
So essentially, the problem of urban slums growing is just universal. In the Philippines, the slum population has grown and not reduced as steadily as it has in other East Asian countries. And because Metro Manila is what we call both a mega city as well as a primate city, which means it's the biggest city in the country, and it is a very big city, so everybody will come to it and not anywhere else. It's not expected that its population will stop growing anytime soon. So it's, urban, and the thing is that urban areas are important. They contribute, even Manila contributes like 80% of GDP in the country. Agricultural life is declining in the Philippines. It's a big challenge. They need to increase agricultural production. And urban growth is an engine of growth, so those agricultural laborers will keep coming to cities. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk about poverty, but urban slums, again, are not uniformly poor. In many places, it's the housing shortage that forces lower middle income people into slums. So in other places, it's even in Metro Manila, 40% of people who are considered to be living in slums are poor. So not everybody is poor,
Yep.
right?
Exactly.
And why are they poor? So are they income poor? Do they not earn enough money every day?
Yeah.
Or are they poor because they are spending so much money on services, right, that you and I don't have to spend our money on? Just really interesting dynamics. So the houses headed by, in the Philippines, houses headed by people who have no jobs are less likely to be poor than houses headed by people who have bad jobs. And you know why that is? It's very strange. It's because of remittances.
Uh-huh.
So you can have a household that's headed by somebody who's unemployed, but they may not be poor because they're really dependent on remittances. The big challenge in the Philippines, and as it is in many slums across the world, is not underemployment. It's not that it's unemployment. So people who are working are in good jobs. It's that people who are not working at all and are just basically going from trying to make $1 here and $1 there, are essentially never going to get out of poverty.
Yeah.
May I add something? That's such a good point. For example, Market 3 slum is where many of the people who I worked with live. They work in the fish port, often working 12, 18, even 24-hour shifts because the wage is so low.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where the methamphetamine comes in. They take methamphetamine to work the long hours, get hooked, then they become targets. So it's this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they're not working, they're not getting paid fairly.
Mm-hmm.
And presumably the war on drugs could also target Filipinos outside of the slums, but there seems to be this focus on the slum communities. In your work, James, do the people have a sense that they're being singled out and that Duterte is to blame for this? And you mentioned that the view hasn't changed toward him, so I'd be curious about that, and also in the context of economic opportunity for them.
Yeah, it has changed, but not completely. Yeah, it's pretty common knowledge that the middle class are not getting targeted, and obviously the wealthy are not. In fact, they have gated communities. They don't let the assassins in.
Yeah.
But this is not happening in middle class neighborhoods at all. They're completely safe as houses. I mean, with rare exceptions. So you go across town to Makati, nothing's happening. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not exactly sure. Maybe you might have a view on this. My feeling is that Duterte's picking low-hanging fruit, and he can say, "Look, what I'm doing, at very little risk to him, legal risk, because they are pretty much disempowered." Yeah, but across town, it's not happening. And in the countryside, it's not happening. This is pretty much, it is shifting. But it's pretty much an urban phenomenon. It's happening in Cebu, Metro Manila in the outskirts. And apparently, like, it was happening in places like, well, it's still happening in Quezon City. Navotas is a part of Metro Manila, but it moved to places like Cavite in the south and Bulacan in the north. And Filipinos follow who the chiefs of police are. And apparently the guy who was head of the police in Quezon City when it was the most deadly place has moved down to Cavite, which is south of Manila. So it is an evolving process.
I mean, that, I don't know if I should interject, but I do think that that just goes to what we often in urban literature call the right to the city. Who has a right to the city, right? We're all citizens. We should be able to move around wherever we want to go. If you want to live in a village, you should be able to live in a village. If you want to live in a city, you should be able to live in a city. But the poor don't have a right to the city. And slum populations are notoriously undercounted in the world. And in the Philippines, it's even a worse problem of undercounting because the government doesn't want to count everybody who's living in informal housing and settlements. This means that there's that many X number more people who don't have access to services. So that's one thing. The second is they don't necessarily want to provide services to poor people in slums because there's a belief that if they do that, then more people will come. So this is common. I mean, this is not unique to the Philippines in any way whatsoever. It's basically this idea that providing services to the poor validates their reason for coming to the city, and then more of them will come, you know. Yeah. And the education system in the Philippines, they're all literate, but it's not quality education at all. They're far behind in their reading scores as say compared to Vietnamese students at the exact same level. So there is a problem in terms of sort of the quality of employment. I mean, I hate being unprepared, so I did a bunch of very quick reading for the last 3 days, and the bank and the IMF just did large new projections on growth in the Philippines, and everybody's really optimistic. Yeah. Growth rates have climbed again, it's 6.7%. But both of the publications talk about the biggest threat to Filipino prosperity being equity and unequal growth and inequality. Yeah. And part of that inequality lies in sort of the value of the employment they're finding and the education.
And those are the ripples. And also they have a history of insurgency. So maybe the MPA will come back, for example.
Yeah, that's true. Tanvi, when we were talking about this earlier, we were looking at other examples from other countries that would be similar to the Philippines as case studies, and just in your experience, and that have similar dynamics that we were talking about today. India was one of them. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's similar and it's different. I mean, I think that one of the things that these images remind me of is a book that every time I read it, she paints such a beautiful picture. So there are no pictures, but there's a picture in my head, and that's Catherine Boo's book called Behind the Beautiful Forevers. I don't know if,
it's a great book,
if any of you, I mean, I read it in my class, and I've suggested it for Intro to Dev or the Pro Seminar, and it's just one of those books that is just so granular in its description. You remember those people in your head. So, you know, the violence that happens in slums is, I think in this case, it's different. So all slums are violent, right? I think so that's the similarity. The violence can be inter-household violence, or it can be between households. It can be over very scarce resources. It can be driven by the slum lord who wants people out of their houses. Or it can be, in this particular case, from the police, from outside. So there's always violence. It's just a matter of who's perpetrating the violence, right? I think so in that case, the slums are very similar. I think that how maybe some Indian slums are different is that there's political representation within slums. And so different political parties do different kinds of favors inside slums. So if there's an election coming, the slum could suddenly get access to tankered water, for instance. So basically that political representation within the slum, or the fact that people living in slums are allowed to vote, makes a big difference in terms of who they're able to access. Another thing that's common, and I think you didn't talk about this, is that the danger that people face in slums is not just from other people. It's fires, for instance, floods. So people are living under this constant fear that, one little match and their house is going to be gone. Rainfall, there's no drainage, there's nothing. Their houses, their belongings will be flooded. So that's also common amongst all slums everywhere in the world. And, when they're concrete housing and really cramped housing, et cetera, they're still a little bit better off. But when it's housing that looks like this, then none of their belongings, no matter how hard fought and how hard gained, are safe.
Question for you, how's the upward mobility compare in Indian slums versus Philippines, if you know?
So behind the beautiful, everybody who lives in slums thinks that they're going to find their way out of them. No matter how much they love their neighbors, they don't want to live there, right? One of the most interesting things that has happened, and I think this happened in Brazil as well, in the favelas, is not that people are moving out of slums, but that slums are becoming regularized. So can you allow, because there's just no room, right? So there's the people who thought that they were going to move away from slums maybe now are just dreaming of having their slums be better places to live in. The other problem, of course, is that as slums get raised for either better infrastructure or just gentrification and better housing, you're having the idea of having upward mobility, so people get their own houses, but they're placed so far away from jobs that they're sort of like now in these peri-urban areas and far, far, far away, and they're not necessarily accessing all of those employment opportunities. Why do people live in slums, especially in India? It's because you don't have to pay for transport. You can walk, there's plenty of opportunities for employment all around you.
I've heard that, actually. Free housing, but it's 20 kilometers out of town. How do we get to our job?
Exactly. So I think that upward mobility is becoming a bit of a dream that's not being realized.
Interesting. James, at what point does your role, given all of these challenges and the proximity that, the closeness that you have with the subjects that you cover, at what point does your role as documentary photographer become advocate, or does that even happen, right?
That's a really tough line, isn't it?
Right.
I can't remember what Christiane Amanpour said, but basically she's faithful to the facts, the truth, not to be neutral. And so, for example, in this subject, one could make the argument that I'm advocating for the subjects, but I'm laying the facts out there, and I don't see another side to this story, quite frankly, at least from the point of view of extrajudicial killings. There just is not another side of the story. If people are being arrested, that's something else. It's a fine line, but to me, what I'm doing is I am telling the families what my intention is to do, and that is to show the facts of their lives so that they feel like they're letting somebody in who's not taking advantage of them. And I promise them I'll show what's happening to as many people as I can through publications. They understand I have to pay rent. And I'll let the facts fall where they will. And that's all I can do as a photographer and a journalist. But it's important to me, and I keep in touch with people, and then we're human beings. We become friends. But that doesn't mean I'm going to fudge the facts in their favor. I think a perfect example would be concern with Remy, 85 years old. She needs Lourdes, her daughter-in-law, to help her. So it's tempting to omit Lourdes, what Lourdes is doing. Because if Lourdes is arrested, that hurts Remy. So what do? You tell the truth. And that's the hard part, isn't it? Yeah. Because I care about Remy as a human being. She's a very good person. But I have a job to do, and that is to show the facts of what their lives are like, and that's my tacit understanding with them, and I'm open with families about that. So I'm hoping that this will bring positive change, but I'm not going to change the facts to do that. They are what they are.
And is it fair to say that to genuinely cover this issue and to truly tell these people's stories, that you're going to have to continue working on it? I mean, there's a long-term kind of trajectory here, both on this issue of fighting the drug war, but then also these individual stories. And so what's your plan for the future of this work?
But that's the tough part, because the news cycle is so short. I had a hard time getting back the second time, because everybody, people wanted to see the bang bang, and then once the bang bang and the subtlety, nuance started, the media spotlight has way moved on to other things. I want to get back. I'd go back, next week if I could. I'm going to try to put together a plan to get back, because I think what's happening in Jocelyn's life is important. I just want to see how everyone are doing. I want to document what the ripples of these effects from President Duterte. His term is, we were talking about that earlier, I think he's about 2 years into a 6-year term. So this story is far from over.
Yeah, 6 years is a long term.
And so the challenge is to be able to get back, because it's, Philippines is on the other side of the planet. It's closer to me in Japan. Yeah. But it's, so we have financial reality and try, but I'll work it out.
That's great. Well, we'll look forward to the future of this work. We have 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience, so let's open it up. Please introduce yourself, be brief, raise your hand. Okay, we've got a question over here.
My name is Kamal Clayton. I'm a second-year IDEF student. So you basically talked about the emotional burden of actually doing this job, especially when it comes to your colleagues. So I'm asking you personally, like, how do you compartmentalize your emotions, and how do you keep your emotional sanity and health throughout your career? And beyond that, could you elaborate on the most difficult emotional experiences you've had as a photographer?
Well,
So
excellent
hold
question.
that thought for a moment. Is there another question? We can take a couple at the same time. So one in the front here. This gentleman in the blue shirt. Emotional burden.
James, focus on the story. Do you feel that the stories that you're working on now, this story in particular, has the impact that we wanted to have and would have had many years ago, but these days it seems like maybe it's harder to get that impact? What do you do about that?
Good question. Should I answer
Yes,
that one
please.
first?
Go ahead.
That is an excellent question, Steve, because it's a different game now. Life is the same. I mean, people still have issues that we have to cover. I'm finding that, media is not what it used to be. So I can't get a commission just to go in and do this in one shot, what I consider properly. I have to kind of create a tapestry. The last time I went through, I went for The Guardian, L'Espresso, and I had a grant. Thank goodness for that. We have to cobble together these ways, as opposed to, say, Life magazine back in the day. So it is harder, and the message becomes more fragmented as a result. I'm telling my story in Italy, I'm telling it in the UK, it's all online, but as opposed to one big thrust. But it's a different game, much more of a challenge, and we have to keep at it. I'm lucky that I came up a little bit later than some people about the same age as me. I already have survival and tenacity skills. that maybe, somebody who worked for, got great commissions back in the day would find it more frustrating. But and this kind of dovetails into the emotional side. I am driven by a sense of really wanting to get this story out. And it's not an ordinary story, and that's why I'm doing it. Frankly, it gets into my DNA to see people needlessly being subjected to this insanity. You were asking about emotional side. There are a couple of stories that will choke me up. This is one of them. The tsunami. I've lived in Japan for 25 years, and these people look like my family. My wife is Japanese, or my neighbors. And we were just one day away from the same fate as them. That's what really drove that home to me. But generally speaking, it's knowing why you are there, what it is, why it's important to be there, is what gets me through. I never question, the sense of this is important and people need to know about this. And I never doubt that. In this story, I will never doubt that. And so that helps to get through some of the tough spots. But I've had some with this moments, and I still do. And it'll catch you out of nowhere. But as long as you know why you're doing it, then you'll never doubt, that it's the right thing for you to do. And I think it probably will do less damage emotionally if you know why you're doing it.
All right, let's do Cinnamon up here, and then this woman in the middle. We'll take those two questions.
Shamila, am I allowed to ask two?
Ask two very
Okay,
quickly.
all right. I rarely do that, but I knew I couldn't
You are
resist.
allowed.
So, Cinnamon Dortseif, I'm here at SAIS. Shamila and James, this first one's for both of you, and I really don't know the answer. There was a documentary film a few years ago called Cavite, set in the Philippines, and it was about a Philippine slum. Cavite. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Fantastic. And so, Shamila, in your work, do you find that documentary films, and I'm sorry that for people who haven't seen that, so it's, but it's really more about the medium. Which do you find more effective and why? A documentary film or a photojournalistic essay montage such as this, and why? And then Tanvi, for you, this is a question that's kind of vexed me for a long time, so I'd love your insights about the kind of peri-urban areas. And I was very struck all those years that I lived in Manila with so many people exiting the city at the end of the weekend, and so it really became a much less crowded place. But it was that whole problem of people commuting 4 hours one way for a job. What is a start of a policy response? Start of a policy response.
All right.
Interesting.
I think that was like 5 questions, but that's okay. She works here.
And
We'll
there's
let it go.
Allison, too.
We like her. No, okay. We'll try to remember.
I'll try not to make this a two-parter as well. My name is Allison. I'm a student at SAIS. But for a journalist, how would you hope that your work influences policymakers? And from the policymakers' perspective, how does photojournalism affect how you would make policy, whether that be through kind of having a greater advocacy angle, or does it affect it at all, I guess?
Great questions. Okay. Tanvi, do you want to tackle the
So I'll just do it really quickly.
policy-related questions?
So,
Yeah.
in terms of peri-urban areas, there isn't a policy. You can't have a policy about peri-urban areas. I think that I often describe urban areas as organisms, and I think there is no one policy or any way to predict how those organisms will change over time. So one way, of course, that we're talking about peri-urban areas is essentially by trying to figure out how to concentrate activity more efficiently within cities. Because even though Metro Manila seems to you incredibly claustrophobic and concentrated, there are still efficiencies to be gained in how it's organized, so that some of those people don't have to travel 4.5 hours. The other issue, of course, is how can the people who live 4.5 hours away have opportunities where they live rather than in Metro Manila? And those two are very different kinds of policy responses. Right, so, and also the structure of the peri-urban area matters, whether it's outside the ring of one city or it's lots of little cities. In some cities, in Latin America, all the poor are pushed to the outside, whereas in some cities in Asia and in Africa, there are slums dotted throughout the city, inside the city, so that the opportunities for the poor are inside the city and they're living inside the city. So very different based on the geography of the city. And so I know that's hedging your question, but I don't think that there is a single policy that's working, yeah. In terms of Allison's question, I think it's a really good question because I think a lot of money is wasted on trying to do ineffective policy, advocacy. And if the people who say they're doing advocacy would just be a little bit more cognizant of the other tools around them, including serious photojournalism or photography, they would be more effective advocates. And I think that one thing that we are just terrible at is we don't understand that it's not just our giving voice to the poor, but the poor being able to voice their own voice that is important. And I think that if we were just equally cognizant of trying to create space where the people whose voice we're trying to project could voice their own, opinions in a valid way, that would be much, much more effective as an advocacy tool than anything else that we do. But I completely, I agree with you that one, policymakers don't understand why people listen or why they don't listen. And if not policymakers, us, policy analysts or policy writers or policy producers. And the second is that it's not in the interest of power structures to sometimes give up their power. And so trying to listen to the voice of the poor is something that they don't want. And if we don't learn how to do it, then policies for the poor, which are based on inequality and are structural, will never change. Because we don't know how to do it, we keep trying to do it, but we don't know how to do it, and the structures who don't want it to change are very powerful. So there's two strikes against that, and I think we're struggling. We're struggling, especially in cities. Those of us who think about this quite passionately and deeply know how hamstrung we are, both because of where we sit and also because of the tools we use.
You want to talk about the question on film versus photography as tools of, and then there also.
But she also asked about covering it better.
Yep.
Maybe this is a bit of pie in the sky, but I'd love to have more long reads, more follow-up. Stories just disappear. More knowledge from, and I'm not saying it because I'm with Tanvi and Shamila. I'd like to see more input from experts than we get, people who are who know the place, are invested in the mechanisms, the context. I'd like to see more of that. That's the pie in the sky part, because that media tends to think they tend to go from visually explosive event to visually explosive event, and nuance gets thrown aside, and nuance is important.
Yeah. So just to answer Cinnamon's question a little bit, I think we live in an age where everyone is essentially a documentary photographer, and that can be a very good thing in some ways. You know, you have your phone, you can just document something, and it can be very politically powerful. But because it's been so kind of normalized, I think we forget about like what the true power of photography can be as evidence of certain conflict, for example. And I think that's where it becomes really intriguing. It's a really intriguing question. It reminds me of a film that we showed a couple weeks ago at the school about Syria, and in which, I can't remember the journalist's name, but it was the one journalist in the past few years who interviewed Assad, and he showed him a photograph of the, basically like a mass grave that this police officer had kind of smuggled out. And he said, look, look at this. How can you explain this? And Assad basically had every question in the book to discredit the photo. He said, how do you know this is Syria? How do you know these are Syrians? How do you know these bodies are real people? How do you know it's not doctored, right? So because of the age of media that we actually live in and the tools that we have, it rendered the photograph not influential in some ways, right? And so I think that there are definitely limitations given the political climate to how we can use documentary work with the powers that be. Not with us. We understand, but I think it's been politicized just as much as it's been normalized in our culture, in every culture. So there's that challenge, and I think there's a lot to explore there. But in my own experience, so there's Joe Newman, there's the famous Joe Newman over there. He and I co-edited a book on Donald Trump's inauguration, and it was a photography book called Unprecedented, and I was one of the photographers, and for me, looking at those images a couple years later, and I was talking about this with a colleague today, we learned so much more just in looking at those images than all of the noise that we hear in the news. And when we first saw the book, it was a very different experience for us. And we've got some other photographers who contributed the book in the audience too. But I think, again, as historical evidence, not just as evidence in conflict, it can be very useful if we, as people who study history, who study political science, incorporate those disciplines or those other, people like James into our conversation. So I think that's kind of the big picture goal, is this cross-pollination of ideas so we can learn better and do our jobs equally better from, each other's ideas.
Do you feel, though, your context, you're being a professor studying these issues, fortify your images? I think an informed observer can produce stronger images because you can put in context what you're
So she's
doing.
The professor over here.
So,
I don't have
you
the
know
privilege.
what? I have to say that I do this one
But-
assignment that Maya can talk about in our urban class, where one of our assignments is a pechakucha, and it's recorded. So I don't know if you know what a pechakucha. It's just 20 images with a script in the back, and so the students pick a problem, then they pick 20 images, and they narrate a policy story or a story about with those images in the back, and we record it. And I cannot tell you, I read so many papers, and they go in my head, and whatever, they're great. Those pechakuchas I never forget. I bring them back every few years and say, oh, I remember X did it on a dump site in Ghana, and we're going to watch that, or Y did it on.
So we really need to have like a neuroscientist on this issue to explain to us that there's something unique about film. But one final point, and I know there's another question in the audience.
Yeah.
I do think that film does something for, let's say, American culture, which is, we're not isolated in this room or in this city, but I do think that a lot of Americans don't get the kind of exposure to the world that a lot of us are privileged to get, nor do, maybe they don't want to seek it out, or doesn't, their path doesn't take them there. And so film has this unique quality of showing you a place that you might never be able to see, and humanizing a conflict. And for me, as somebody who, I've worked, most of my career was in national security, working on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I was still not able to grasp fully the experiences of the soldiers that we were sending out to the war until I saw the films like Restrepo, or other like actual footage of them there. And it struck me years later, after I had left the National Security Council and the State Department, that I didn't even really think about those people in the way that I should have. I thought about them every day, but not in the way that I should have. I might not have made different decisions, but I think I would have processed the information much differently, and I would have reached different personal conclusions, if not different policy conclusions, because I was just kind of like a random bureaucrat. I was not somebody of influence to a certain extent. So, but I do think that's where, and that's where we're trying to incorporate these kinds of different platforms in the school, where we don't have time to do it in the classroom. There's too much to learn, right? So we're going to try to do it outside of the classroom. All right, we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
All right, thanks, Jonathan Christ. You have been working in Asia as a journalist for quite some time, and I imagine you're pretty plugged into the network of other journalists working in the region as well. I was hoping you could say something about the overall state of media freedom in Asia today. Two examples come to mind. There's the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, and there's also this growing problem of internment camps in Western China. Do you feel like you and your network are being granted access to all the places you need to be in the region today? Do you think there's any spots where you've been surprised at the openness and surprised or disappointed at the relative closure? Which countries should we be paying attention to, but we're not being let to see?
This is a fertile question. Well, the short answer is it's getting tougher. I'm lucky, actually. Obama went to China just before I got my last visa. I have a 10-year visa in China. But social media is, as a journalist, as a photographer, you don't exist unless you have Instagram and Facebook, but it can be used against you. So in 2016, I was turned down for a visa in India. Apparently, Prime Minister Modi does not like journalists who do critical work. I know several journalists, believe it or not, who cannot return to India. I didn't have a problem this past summer. Surveillance in China, and this is, maybe I can get on my pulpit a little bit. I did a story on being Tibetan in China now. I went into the Tibetan areas of Sichuan, and I've been to Amdo. I was chased out of a town in Amdo last time because of the cameras. I went into a town in Lijiang, the Tibetans would call it Kham, the Chinese call it Sichuan. Everybody got off the bus and they scanned their national ID, so they knew everyone who was coming into the town and everybody who was coming out of the town. Every block of the main street had riot police and shields and fire extinguishers. Why? Because people are lighting themselves on fire. And it's not getting reported. And I was there for 4 days, and it was time to go because first was, hi, how are you, from the police. Then it's, where did you come from? And then it's, where are you going next? And then the next step was like, I'm not going to go down to the police station. I have to leave. These are not getting reported. It's getting harder. Surveillance is getting better. Facial recognition on the street. Visas are getting harder to do. But press freedom in each country is different. Japan is fairly open. There's a lot of self-censorship. But other countries, access to the Rohingya areas was quite difficult. As you know, journalists were arrested on the Myanmar side, but they were also driven out on the Bangladesh side. So our job is getting difficult. In the Philippines, it's either 1 or 2 in the world for journalists being killed. Mexico's number 1 or number 2, and Philippines would be the other. So our job is more important than ever, but we have to be mindful that we're not going to be welcomed with open arms. And to be careful. You have to be careful.
I'm glad you asked that question. We hadn't touched on that. It's obviously, given what's happening in the Middle East as well, we need to talk about that. We're out of time. I want to thank everyone for their wonderful questions, and I want to thank James and Tanvi for educating us today. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Please enjoy the reception. The SAIS Perspectives winners are in the Herder room directly behind us, and then James's work and the rest of the focus on the story images are over there in the NHTSA cafeteria, but please enter or exit through those doors back there. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.